How much should you pay for software development? I'm Austin Wood, founder of Fractal Labs, and in this video, my aim is to teach non-technical founders how to have intelligent discussions with software teams about the complexity and potential cost of building their ideas. I was talking with a startup founder recently. He's been working on his idea for a long time and just recently received his first seed investment to start implementing his idea. He said to me, "Austin, I don't know what to do. I've been talking with 2 development teams about implementing my idea, and one of them quoted me a maximum budget of $40,000. They said, yes, we could definitely build your idea for under this amount. The other team said it would be at least $100,000 to build my idea. He said, how is this possible that I have such a big range? On the one hand, I feel like the guys charging me $100,000 are ripping me off. And on the other hand, I'm worried the guys that are telling me they can do it for under 40 aren't going to do a good job. What do I do?" So I said, okay, I'm happy to help you figure that out. Let me just ask you a few questions to understand your idea a little bit better. So I started to ask him a few questions, and he knew the answer to some of them, and some of them I had to assign him as homework. And what was most interesting was that all the questions I asked, neither of the 2 companies had asked him any of these questions. So I told him, honestly, I wouldn't trust either of them, because if they aren't asking these questions, how could they possibly understand your idea and give you an accurate estimate? If this is you saying to yourself, I want to build an app, and you don't know where to start, this is the series of videos for you. We're going to go through all the questions that you should be asking yourself if you want to build an app. In the first video, we looked at answering the question, why? Why do you want to build an app? Specifically, what's the purpose? Who is this going to serve, and how is it going to help them? How are they going to use it? Also, what's your expected return on investment? Are you doing this for joy? Is this to support an existing business? Are you wanting to start a new business that is primarily app-based and will generate a profit? Or are you a startup that you're hoping will get acquired someday? Today, we'll be looking at answering the question, how complex is your idea? What are the questions you should be asking yourself and be able to answer in order to determine how complex your app idea is and how much it will cost to build? So let's start by talking about scope and MVP. What is the minimum viable product for your idea? So you have some vision, some idea for your app. And this vision might be larger than the first product that you're going to build. Now, depending on the type of app and your expected return on investment and the size of this vision, the scope may or may not be a large part of that full vision, or your scope for your minimum viable product might be a very small part of that larger and still poorly undefined, large, ambiguous vision. Now, as an example, the OptiListen app that we just finished building for our clients, that idea was fairly well defined. And so the MVP was probably about 80 to 90% of the original vision. There were a few things like social features and whatnot that we said, that can wait until version 1.1. That's not part of the 1.0 MVP release. Of course, as we started building the app, we came up with more and more ideas. And some of them we said, oh, okay, that fits within the current scope. We'll expand the MVP a little bit. Some of them we said, that's a really good idea and that has to wait. That falls outside of the scope. So this is a very important concept. The idea for this app was very straightforward. I want an app that tells me during a meeting what percentage of time I'm listening versus speaking. We were able to define that very well and say with a high degree of certainty what the final product will look like and what it will take to build that. Now, let's compare this idea to a much larger idea, perhaps a medical or a health app that uses artificial intelligence to combine all of the user's data and give them suggestions on how to live healthier. That's a huge, really big vision. So we need to start with a very small subset of those features. Perhaps the MVP of this really big vision looks like a user can log in, they can create an account, and they can connect Apple Health and upload data, right? Just 3 things. Of course, the full vision is much, much bigger than that, but we have to start somewhere. It's very tempting as a founder to say, all of my ideas are important. I need all of them in the MVP. We have to have all of them before we launch. And many startups thrive or die based on how rigorously they build the features that they know users are going to love versus building all the features that they think and hope their users are going to want. So the next thing we'll talk about is your front-end apps. And now we distinguish a front-end app from a back-end app in that this is the app that the user interacts with, as opposed to something on the server that is storing data and performing logic behind the scenes. So this is an app that the user interacts with. Perhaps it's an app that they downloaded and installed through the App Store, and they're using this on their phone. Or perhaps it's a website, a web app that they interact with through the browser. Now, to implement your idea, you want to think about how many front-end apps does this actually require? A good example of this is Uber Eats. So if you search Uber Eats in the App Store, you'll find 3 distinct apps. There's an app for the customer who wants to order food delivered to them. There's an app for the restaurants to prepare the food. And there's an app for the driver to deliver the food from the restaurant to the customer. And I'm sure that there's at least one admin app, probably a web app, that Uber uses behind the scenes to manage everything. So Uber Eats is at least 4 different front-end apps. So the next thing you want to decide is, are each of these apps going to be a web app or a native app? Now, how do you decide this? Think about who is your user and how and when are they typically going to be using your app? If your typical user uses the app just once, they show up, do something, leave, and rarely come back, then a native app can add some friction to have to install it from the App Store, wait for it to download. You probably are better off with a web app. If, on the other hand, your typical user uses the app multiple times a day, on the go, and maybe even when they're offline, then you definitely want to have a native app. You know what? I'll actually add one more option here, and that is progressive web apps. Now, progressive web apps have come a long way in the past few years, and they're still lacking some of the native functionality that you would expect from a native app. The great thing about a progressive web app is that you can build web code, and then the user can download and install this app onto their device just through the browser without going through an app store, and it will behave somewhat like a native app. This is a slightly cheaper option than a native app with some compromises and limitations that you may want to consider if a native app would be convenient for some users but is not critical. If you require native features like push notifications or access to all the device accelerometers, then you're going to go with a native app. And a native app is going to be a little bit more expensive because there's additional overhead for complying with all of Apple's and Google's guidelines and frameworks and publishing the app. Native apps typically feel better. They feel more natural and fluid to the user. And if that's the way you want to go, you should be prepared to budget an extra 20% in the cost for your front-end apps to deal with the additional overhead of publishing a native app compared to deploying a web app. And if you say, I want a web app and a native app, I'd say, that's not scope. That's not in scope of MVP, right? So think back to the previous point, right? You want to start with a minimum viable product, and you definitely don't need to develop both of these independently in the beginning to start your idea. Maybe that's your long-term vision. Maybe that's where the company goes. Because of user feedback, you determine that both of them are necessary, but it's definitely not the way to start building a minimum viable product. Pick one, web app or native. We can think again about Uber Eats and each of the apps here. The Uber Eats customer app certainly exists as both a native app and a web app. They want people to be able to order food wherever they are and as conveniently as possible if they choose to install the app, or as frictionless as possible if they just want to open up their laptop and go to the website. The driver, on the other hand, there is no web app for the driver Uber Eats app. You have to download the native app because the expected use case is that the driver is in their car with the phone on the dashboard, and that's how they're navigating to make the delivery. They're not driving while fumbling with their laptop on their lap. There's no web app to perform the driver functionality of Uber Eats. And the last main question here that we'll think about for your front-end apps is, how many screens do you have? And not just the number here, we're talking about quantity, but also what's the complexity of those screens and what's the uniqueness of all the screens. So a screen with a lot of widgets and things that the user can interact with and move and lots of shapes is going to take more time to build than a login screen with an email and password field and a single button. Also, if you have 100 screens, how similar are they? Are each of them very unique and complex in their own right? Or do you have perhaps 2 or 3 complex patterns that then get reused in various ways throughout the app? If the latter is the case and you're building your app correctly, each of those screens that are similar will share code, and building each subsequent screen will be easier than building the initial screen. If, on the other hand, each screen is totally different, we want to account for that when we're estimating the complexity of your project. Next, let's talk about data, the entities and attributes that make up your data. In your database, these are the tables and the columns that define those tables. Before you begin building your app, you want to have some understanding of what kind of data your app is going to need to process in order to function the way that it does. One entity that your app probably has is a user entity. Think about what attributes does a user need? Do they have a name? First name, last name. Are both of them required? Is last name optional? Do they have date of birth? Again, think about, are these required or optional attributes? A password, email address, phone number, address. What other attributes does this entity have? What other entities do you need for the app to function? Is the user creating orders, which consist of menu items? And menu items as an entity have prices, names, images. Having all of this defined, at least to the best of your ability, before you begin talking with a developer or a software team, will help them give you a better estimate because they'll be able to more fully understand the complexity of your idea. Now, the next thing we want to consider when talking about data is, where will the data be stored? Will it be stored in local storage on the user's device, or will it be stored on a server, somewhere in the cloud? Storing data on a server is going to involve a lot more work than simply relying on local storage. Of course, only using local storage has its limitations. You can't build a social app where users are interacting with each other, or a user places an order and then a staff member fulfills that order in a different app only with local storage. They need to be able to share the same data. Multiple users need to access, read, and write to the same data stores, so we need to use a server in that case. Using OptiListen again as an example, the initial scope of that app had a login screen. Users were creating an account, logging in, and then storing their session history on a server. And as we began to discuss the idea a little bit more, we realized that this was actually totally unnecessary to the core functionality of the app. And so by removing this option of a user logging in and relying on local storage to store that session data, we're able to greatly reduce the scope of the minimum viable product. This was a great decision that we made early on because it allowed us to put our attention and effort developing features that were going to be critical to the user having a good experience, rather than things that were just fluff and nice to have, but not actually making a difference to the core functionality. Next, let's consider your backend. First of all, do you need a backend? If your answer to the question about local storage versus server was that your app can function by relying entirely on local storage, then there's a good chance that you actually don't need a backend. You may, if there's some additional functionality or logic that needs to be performed on a server. However, if you don't need to be storing data on a server, then maybe your app doesn't need a backend. Now, if you do need a backend, if you are going to be storing data on a server, think about, do you need a custom backend? There are services such as Google Firebase, which allow you to store all of your app's data in the cloud on a server without writing any custom backend code. Now, this is a great option if it will work for you. So how do you make this decision? How do you know if Firebase or some similar service will work for you and work for you over the long term? I would say consider what we talked about regarding scope and MVP. If the scope of your MVP is 80 or 90% of your entire vision. And you can say with a high degree of certainty that, yes, this is my idea. It's not going to grow much more complex than this, and Firebase will work for this initial MVP scope. Then you can probably rely on Firebase for the lifespan of your app. If, on the other hand, you say, yeah, Firebase would work for this small scope, but my vision is huge. This app is going to evolve and grow very complex over time. In situations like this, where companies have decided to rely on Firebase or a similar service for their MVP, as the app evolves, grows, and grows more complex, we eventually reach a point where Firebase can no longer meet the needs of your app. This will lead to growing pains and complications later on, and you'll eventually need to invest additional effort and headache into migrating from that service onto your own custom backend. So if your idea looks more like this, and you have the budget to build a custom backend from the beginning, I highly suggest doing so. If, however, you don't have the budget, you just need to get a prototype out there, then using a service like Firebase can be a good solution. And if your idea looks like this, and you're confident that Firebase will work now and for the foreseeable future, then you can go with a service like this and forego writing any custom backend for your app. So the last thing we'll consider here is, what is the expected load and traffic that your app is going to handle? Why is this important? An app that has tens or hundreds of users each day needs a much less sophisticated infrastructure than an app that's going to have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users each day. Now, of course, we build that smaller version and we evolve, we grow into that larger version as your user base grows. However, you do want your app to be prepared to handle any load before you get to that point. This is a fine balancing act between being ready and prematurely optimizing and wasting efforts before it's necessary. To give you an example of when you might want to think about something like this, when I was CTO at Just Hive, a social media company, we would frequently run marketing promotions. In the beginning, at any given day, we had dozens of users using our app, which for a social media app is nothing, right? So a very simple and naive backend architecture could suffice for dozens of users. But then occasionally we would run marketing campaigns and we would get a social media influencer to agree to, they would post on Snapchat or Instagram and say, hey, followers, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be posting exclusive content on Just Hive, on this new social media platform. And we would get an influx of sometimes 3,000, 5,000 users trying to use our app in a single day, going up from a dozen. And in the beginning, the backend just was not built to handle this load. What happened is when we had thousands of users using the app at the same time, it would just slow down and become incredibly painful to use, and in some cases be completely unusable. Now, this is a rare edge case. Social media apps are weird because you need the network effect in order for them to be useful. You need lots of people on the app in order for users to get any kind of value out of it. So this is something that will constantly be evolving over time. You'll always be adding additional sophistication and infrastructure to handle increased load. And it's something that you want to tackle at the right point in time. So think about your roadmap. How many users do you expect to be on your app in the first several months, in the first year? And build your backend now accordingly so that you'll be able to scale it easily when the time comes. The last piece we'll consider today for determining the complexity of your idea is what functionality and integrations are required in order for your app to perform what it's intended to perform. Now, some of this may be very obvious and apparent based on the designs of your front-end apps, and some of it might require a little bit more thinking. Some typical types of functionality you might see in your app are payments, communications, or machine learning, artificial intelligence, to learn and produce some kind of result based on the data your users are inputting. Now, This is by no means an exhaustive list of the types of functionality you can have in your app, but once you've determined the functionality that your app needs, the next step is to determine what services or tools am I going to integrate in order to achieve that functionality. In the case of payments, our go-to option is Stripe for processing credit card payments. We've done that many times, and so if a client says we want to integrate credit card payments and we're going to use Stripe, we can say with a high degree of certainty how much effort will be involved in implementing that. If the client has more obscure requirements for their payment processing and they want to use a different service, well then I need to know what service they're going to use so that I can research their APIs, how they're documented, and before I can give them an accurate estimate of what it will cost to do that integration for them. With communications, do you need to send text messages, make phone calls to mobile phones or landlines? Twilio can do all of these things. And similar to using Stripe for payments, we've integrated Twilio with dozens of apps. And it's something that we can say with a high degree of certainty, yes, we can implement this for this much effort. Do you want to send emails? Well, there's multiple services that allow you to send emails to your customers. Do that research, pick the service that you want to use, and then come back to your development team and say, this is what we're going to use for email communication. What will it take to do this integration? They'll be able to give you a much more accurate answer than if you just say, I need to send email. And this piece of the functionality and integrations is so important because it's not really the screens that make your app special, right? It's the functionality that makes your app special. Being able to communicate this clearly to the developers that you're working with will make a big difference in the kind of estimate that you get from them as to the complexity involved in implementing your idea. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, I'd encourage you to like, follow, and subscribe, because in the next video, we'll be talking about who should build your app. Once you've determined that you want to build an app, you've answered this question, why? What's my purpose? Who's my audience? Who will this app serve? How will it serve them? What's my expected return on investment? How complex is my idea? You're now ready to start thinking about building your idea. We'll be looking at who should build your app based on your available budget and your answer to all of these questions. And also, where do you go about finding this person? Hey there, do you want to build an app? What app do you want to build? A mouse catching app? You don't need an app for that.